Alright guys, welcome back to the video. So in this one we're going to be talking about the Veritas skewed block plane. So this was my first quality hand tool. Before I had this, I had some super cheap chisels and just some other very basic hand tools and that. But this was the first high-end one that I bought, and there's one very specific reason why I chose this block plane over any other tool all over the market, is because it's probably the most useful and has the most bang for your buck when you're just getting started in woodworking. Alright, so we're just going to go through and kind of break this thing down and talk about the different parts of it. So the body of this block plane is about 6 inches long, which is a little bit longer than most of the other brands' block planes, just purely because this thing has a skew and it's meant to be a little bit larger to kind of pull double duty compared to some other brands of block planes. Now this block plane also has a rabbiting feature, which means that the point of the blade, that little point right on the end there, can stick out over the edge or can line up perfectly with this side edge of the plane here. What this allows you to do is sneak up right to the side of a tenon, clean up those shoulders really nicely, or like the name suggests, you can use it to cut or clean up rabbets. So this is a very important feature to have when you're just getting into woodworking or getting into more of the, the fine woodworking side of things, because having a good rabbiting block plane like this lets you tune up any joinery that you're going to cut, whether it's dovetails, mortise and tenon, rabbet joinery, half laps. All this different type of joinery can be very easily cleaned up with a block plane like this that has that rabbiting feature to it. And so this block plane also has a variable mouth. So you can see that this opening here is pretty large, and just by loosening this knob on the front here, I can move this whole front piece in and tighten up that whole space in there. And so what this does is it tightens up the overall spacing in there and gives you a much cleaner shaving. So if you're working with more figured wood or just very dense wood, having that mouth a little bit closer together can make it a little bit easier and give you better results for tear out, because this will keep pressure on those forward grains as they're being cut to just give you a little better quality of a cut. Also on the front of this block plane, there's a little scoring blade. Now I don't use this very often, but when I do need it, it is very handy. So what this scoring blade does is anytime you're cutting across the grain, so any like mortise and tenon joinery, you're cleaning up those tenons, what this blade will do is it'll score the edges just a little bit below where your blade is going to cut, and then when you cut through it, you're not going to get as bad of tear out on the exiting side. So typically what will happen with the rabbiting plane is when you exit off that side, it'll rip out some of the fibers in that. But that scoring blade is meant to sever those fibers before the blade hits it and makes sure that you just get a very clean cut. And this is a really nice feature because it's not very common in a lot of rabbiting planes that you'll see. And so Veritas definitely stepped up and proved that they wanted to make a quality tool here by adding in this scoring blade, because it does make a massive difference. Now, like I said, I don't use it very often because most of the time when I'm working on joinery, I'm tuning up joinery, I'm not too worried about how much damage I'm causing. But the important thing is when I need it, it's there and it can make a massive difference. Now, another interesting feature in the body here is that there's 3 set screws kind of set, one right near the end of the blade here, one right back near the handle, and then one on the opposite side. And what these set screws do is let you set a specific position for your blade. Now, I haven't had luck using these set screws to hold my blade in place because they always seem to back out slowly over time. I don't know if it's something that I'm doing wrong or something that's not, nicely set up in the plane, but most of the time when I'm setting this thing up, I just rely on setting the blade into the body and just following the normal setup procedure as with any other hand plane. So I think pretty much all Veritas hand planes have that feature of having those set screws in there, and they can be used to help speed up alignment and adjustments of your blade, but overall I don't find them to be super useful. And so one thing to note about the body of this block plane is that you're going to constantly need to monitor it for being flat, because I've had major issues with this plane staying perfectly flat on its sole. Now you can kind of see on the bottom of the plane here that there are still some Sharpie marks from the last time I tried to flatten it, and that's because I just wasn't going for a full flattening. I just wanted to tune it up slightly, so I got most of the surface flattened, and I just touched that up. So I've owned this block plane for a little over 2 years now, and so basically every year I just touch it up slightly, and that seems to be fine. The main thing you have to watch out for is getting any kind of dirt or grime inside the mouth opening here. And so we just remove the front knob, this piece drops right out. And so all you have to make sure of is that you're not getting a buildup of dust inside of this area here, because that can force this front piece down and make it not flat with the rest of your plane. And so when you receive your block plane, it will be perfectly flat. I checked mine right out of the box, it was perfectly flat. But just over time, it will slowly move around and do its thing. And so doing some more research, when I started to notice that the sole of my block plane was not staying flat, it's purely because it's a rabbiting plane. Having this opening on the side creates a lot less support on this whole side of the block plane, which means that the sole does have a tendency to move a little bit more, and it's going to need a little bit more monitoring to make sure that it stays nice and flat. Now, like I said, I only touch this up every, once a year, and it's been just fine so far. I haven't taken any material off the sole. I'm not not flattening it on like 120 grit or 180 grit, anything like that, I generally go and just touch it up on some 2000 grit wet dry sandpaper, just using the surface of my table saw to just give me a nice, perfectly flat reference surface, and that trues it up, without any issue at all. The other thing you have to watch out for with this block plane is rust. Because it has exposed cast iron on all the sides, and generally with the block plane, you're going to be holding it, and you're going to either have your fingers wrapped around onto the sole of it, you're going to be touching the sides of it. Overall, there's a lot of skin on metal contact here. So when you put this tool away, I highly recommend just taking the time to wipe it down with some shop towel. And I found that makes a big difference on whether or not my block plane starts to rust. Whether it's winter or summer, it doesn't matter what time of year, I always try to wipe it down. The other thing you're going to want to do is treat it with some 3-in-1 oil every once in a while. So I would say after every 3 to 5 uses, just give it a light wipe down with some 3-in-1 oil. And over time, that'll build up a little bit of protection on the surface of it, and you can kind of reduce the amount you do it over time. The other trick that you can do to make sure that you're keeping rust off of the plane is to buy the Veritas plane sock, something like that. That's not an expensive option at all, and it's a great way to keep your planes in a nice dry environment. Because what this does is it helps to wick moisture away from the plane itself to help prevent that surface from rusting. So I keep both my low angle jack and this block plane in one of these bags, and it's made a massive difference in how much rust I see on my tools just kind of on a day-to-day basis. And so that's everything to do with the body of this block plane. It's a very simple mechanism, but again, it's complex enough that it lets you do a whole bunch of different things. Having that rabbiting feature lets you do a lot with joinery. Being able to open and close that mouth lets you work with some more complicated grain, and having that scoring blade lets you work across the grain without causing massive tear out. So the next thing to talk about is the blade itself. Now this is a beautifully shaped blade. It's made from PM-V11, which is Veritas's premier tool steel. Honestly, in my opinion, it's better than pretty much any other option on the market, which is why I went for it. And especially in my hand planes, I love this PM-V11 tool steel because it gets razor sharp, but it also holds an edge for a very long time. I'm very bad about sharpening my block blade, and I use it for, cleaning up end grain a lot on tenons and that, and I use this thing almost on a daily basis, and I sharpen it maybe once or twice a month. So I definitely need to get better at my sharpening routine, but overall, this blade does hold an edge really, really well. The one thing you have to be aware of with this blade and sharpening it in specific is that it's going to be a little bit more challenging compared to your standard hand plane blades. So if you just sharpen by hand, then obviously nothing's really going to be that different. You just have to get that bevel rocked nicely in place, and you just sharpen like you would any other blade, just being aware that it's going to be at a slight angle. But if you use a sharpening system like I do, you're going to need a special jig attachment in order to sharpen a skewed blade. And so I have the Veritas Mark II honing guide set, and what you can buy for it is this specifically designed skewed angle guide system. And so all this does is it just replaces that little measuring guide that you normally put on the front of the Mark II honing guide, and just accounts for the skew in the blade. So you can see there that it kind of sets up the blade at that perfect skewed angle. It sets that up inside the jig, and it lets you sharpen that skewed blade super easily. And so that Veritas sharpening system is very handy. The only reason I have that system specifically is because this was my first hand plane, and I had no idea how to sharpen it without buying that skewed angle gauge for that sharpening system. So they definitely go together very well, but that's not to say that you specifically need that Veritas system. There's a lot of other ways you can do it. If you're very careful in your setup, you can pretty easily set up this blade in pretty much any honing guide. You just have to make sure that you're keeping that skew intact, otherwise you're going to ruin the blade. And so the last part of the hand plane is this back piece. Now I have no idea what the technical term for this is. All I know is that it is the piece that provides tension on the blade to keep it locked in place. So it's got this big brass knurled knob on here, which is awesome for tightening this thing up. It's honestly way better than even the Veritas low angle jack because this knob lets you get good access. Now with this plane, what you're going to be doing is there's going to be a lot of adjustments to it. So you're going to constantly need to be going in, adjusting that blade, especially when you're trying to set it up for rabbiting cuts, you're going to be adjusting that blade quite often. And so being able to just go in and slightly adjust the pressure that's on it lets you go in and make very minor adjustments to the blade itself when it's all mounted into the plane. So it's a very nice way to work. Now, what's really nice about this tensioning piece is that it's shaped perfectly to hold in your hand. When you're holding a block plane, basically what you want to do is you want to take this big round part back here, put that right in the center of your hand, and then wrap your fingers around. So your pinky and your ring finger should basically wrap around the base of it. That way, if you're cutting end grain, you can get good support on there. Your middle finger is going to be right near the front there, and then your pointer finger is either going to be on the knob on the front or can rest right on the body. And then your thumb is right near the opening of the blade. So overall, you can get a very good grip on this thing. And this tensioning piece plays a big part in that because if it was smaller, wasn't shaped this way, it would be very hard to get a good solid grip on this plane. but because of the way that it's shaped, it's super easy to have very good control of this block plane. Now overall, it's very easy for me to recommend this block plane because it's one of the best hand tools I've purchased so far. I use it on every single project I do, whether it's a cabinet, a chair, a stool, even some of the smaller stuff like the charcuterie boards and that I make. Having a little block plane like this is just such an awesome tool to have, and adding in those extra features like the movable mouth, the rabbiting feature, and just kind of everything else that goes into this block plane makes it great for just generally having around the shop. Now the one thing to think about with this block plane if you're planning on buying it is that it comes in a left and a right-handed model. Now if you're right-handed, most of the time you're going to want the right-handed one. There's only a few times with this block plane that I've wished that I had the left-handed one, and even then I've found different ways to work around that. And so I wanted to say this for the very end, but you might be wondering what the point of the skew in this skewed block plane is. Now, this is actually a really important feature. As I've done more research into it and I've learned more about it, it actually makes a massive difference to the cut quality that you're going to be performing and how easy it is to cut, both on end grain and straight grain and across the grain, all, basically any way that you're going to be using this block plane. Having that slightly skewed blade makes it just generally easier to cut. You'll quite often find anyone who is teaching lessons about how to use like a low angle jack or basically any other block plane is they tell you that if you're working in difficult wood, if you're having trouble pushing that plane through the wood, all you have to do is slightly skew it, and that makes it easier to cut. So by just having the blade skewed in this block plane, it makes it super easy to cut through figured wood, through end grain, through complex grains, anything like that. This blade I've never really had any issues with it getting caught up, having anything like that. Whereas with my low angle jack, I'll have to go through and skew it in order to get through some of the more complex grains in woods like maple or ash, stuff like that that's very prone to having tear out. That's where you're really going to notice a big difference with that skewed blade, and it does make a massive difference. So if you're trying to compare this block plane and its fairly excessive price compared to basically any other block plane on the market, just that skewed blade alone is worth every extra penny in my opinion. On top of the rabbiting feature, on top of the scoring blade, on top of the variable mouth, that skewed blade makes a massive difference in what I think is the quality and just the usefulness of this block plane. So if you're thinking about purchasing this block plane, I highly recommend it because it is a very good quality tool, and it's something that you'll be able to make tons of use of in your shop and on every single project you do. So if you guys have any questions about this block plane, feel free to leave it in the comments down below. But as always guys, I do hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.